Today we're going to talk about something that really came home to us at our last conversation. When a 29-year-old presenter complained that her generation can't afford to live in Vancouver. But housing's only part of the problem. For many Canadians under, not just 30, but under 40. They're doing what they've been told is the way to a better life. Get smart and work hard, but they're not seeing the payoff. They're certainly not seeing the payoff that their parents' generation saw. So we're going to take a look at Generation Squeeze. What set this off was a editorial in the Globe and Mail called recently, and in April, called "The Death of the Youth Vote." And here's the quote that really captured a much longer editorial. Left off the gravy train are young people. Why? Because they are way less likely to cast a vote than older people are, and they don't make up as large a share of the population as they used to. By being disengaged, they have now become conveniently ignorable, not just by the government, but by the opposition parties too. But do we have a generation that's doomed to a barista's life at Starbucks and living with their parents when they're 35? What's the evidence for generational inequality, and what's to be done? Our presenters are Dr. Paul Kershaw, who's an associate professor at UBC School of Population and Public Health, and the founder of a organization called Generation Squeeze. Thank you very much for the name. It's a national lobbying group. Anastasia Gaisenok, pardon me, Anastasia, is Executive Director of Check Your Head, a Vancouver-based youth-driven social action group. And Tara Mahoney is the co-founder and creative director of Gen Y Media, a creative engagement agency.
In the few minutes that I have to share now that my slides are up, I want to make a few minor points to start the conversation, and I think flow into the next presenter's key bullet points to start us off as well. The first is, if you take a big picture view of how Canada is doing, and you look at one of the most common metrics of economic progress, we look good. Our economy is twice as big as it was in 1976, and if you adjust for inflation and the way the population is growing, we produce an extra 35 grand per household on average. And that average is fundamental to pay attention to, because when you break down the numbers by age, a very different picture emerges for younger Canadians, which increasingly shows that the deck is stacked against younger generations more and more across the city, this province, and the country. Because here in the province of British Columbia, for full-time work, a young person makes $9,000 less than did the same age person a generation ago, if you adjust for inflation. They make thousands less, even though they're more than twice as likely to have post-secondary, and because post-secondary costs so much more than it used to, they start off with larger student debts. And then after going to school longer and paying more for the privilege to land jobs that pay less, young Canadians, especially in British Columbia, but this is the case across the country, have to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for the privilege of trying to live in an average home. Hundreds of thousands of dollars more. Now, happily, the fact those high housing prices are playing out is actually benefiting someone we love. The typical person in my mom's demographic reports somewhere between $165,000 and almost $200,000 in additional wealth in their home. So it's good that the high housing markets are helping people that we do love in our lives. But by contrast, today's high housing prices relative to falling incomes is leaving younger people with much larger debts than in the past. So what's been the national response? And I apologize if this one slide didn't translate onto the Mac computer very well, but here I can summarize it for you. When I look at how governments respond to urgent issues in this country, one of the things I do is take inspiration from some of the great work that we do in support of seniors. Did you know that each year we spend between $33,000 and $40,000 per person over 65? And it matters personally to me because that's my 99-year-old grandmother. Her name is Vivian Lawrence, and she resides in Salmon Arm, British Columbia. And my grandmother uses more medical care than almost any other citizen in the country, and my grandmother's been a senior almost my entire life, drawing importantly on things like old age security and the Canada Public Pension Plan. And these combined policies give my grandmother a great deal of dignity that she otherwise would not have. So I'm a huge champion of these policies. So much so that I take such inspiration from them, I think we should be able to do things that are equally incredible, if not always perfect, but still pretty darn impressive for younger demographics. And while the slide isn't quite beautifully conveyed as it normally does, one of the things you need to know is that each year we spend less than $12,000 per person under 45 if you add up everything. Grade school, medical care for young people, post-secondary, tax breaks for saving for retirement, every tax break for families that exist, employment insurance, parental leave, workers' comp, everything in the kitchen sink adds up to less than what we spend on my grandmother's and my mother's medical care alone. Why is that the case? Why do we have this interesting age pattern unfolding in Canada? The problem is not spending on seniors. The problem is, why is there less urgency to spend on a younger demographic? And there are a range of answers to that, and part of the answer will be, as the Globe and Mail noted, younger people don't show up to vote as much, and Anastasia in particular is going to talk about that. So I'm going to skip over and say there is something equally, if not in my view, more important. And that's that in between elections, years in advance of casting a ballot, when parties are actually shaping their platforms on the left, the right, and the center, younger Canadians are way less organized than our parents and grandparents. And one of the ways I know that is that for decades, there has been a beautiful group called the Canadian Association of Retired Persons that has been lobbying on behalf of those aged 50 and older. And they have an inspiring model. Their About Us page, I see a number of people who could be in the demographic. If you're not already part of CARP, you should join them. They do good work on behalf of my mom and my grandmother. And they're about building political clout for their constituency. They know they have more clout by having more like-minded people associated with them. They have 400,000 members or thereabouts, and they're on a march to 1 million. They're already as big as any political party in the country, as far as I can tell. And they attract people with a very self-interested message. They'll keep money in your pocket. And they do, time and time again. I'm happy to take questions about how this most recent budget reflected CARP wins at the federal level and at provincial levels. But there is no corresponding group doing similar work for younger Canadians. There has never been a lobby for Canadians in their 40s and younger, which leaves imbalance in our world of politics. And so long as that is the case, we now think younger generations deserve a lobby too. And so that is what Generation Squeeze is building. A lobby. How might a lobby work? Well, in some instances, people are going to just feel too tired to be able to do something at the end of a hard work day and say, I don't know how to stay engaged in politics. And we can count, if we have a lobby, on some people suiting up for us, taking meetings with politicians, decision makers, and pushing for policy change that will give every young person a chance to live up to their potential, pay off student debt, afford a family, afford a home, plan for retirement, and do all of this while leaving at least as much as we inherited. But at other moments, when we do have a bit of time and a bit of enthusiasm and energy, the lobby can create effective ways for each of us to be as impactful in the world of politics as any other player. And to join forces with thousands of others at the same time, we can spread out and invite our parents and friends and other networks to join us, and in the process bring the one thing that can outcompete deep pockets in the world of politics, and that is genuine people power. Suiting up and spreading out may not seem like it's akin to Luke Skywalker and his lightsaber, or the Mockingjay and her bow, or Frodo and the One Ring to bind them all, or a sorcerer's wand with Harry Potter. But what we think now is that this lobby can be just as powerful and make each one of us a potential change maker on a grand national scale, because the lobby has the potential to protect medical care and old age security for our parents and grandparents, the people we love, while simultaneously exercising influence in new ways that encourage governments on the left, the right, and the center to change policy to ease the squeeze on younger Canadians.
The generational inequality and the situation we find ourselves now is definitely an issue for youth. We know that because we work with youth, but also because we're youth ourselves. I'm in my early 30s. I can totally relate to all the issues that were kind of alluded to in terms of high housing costs, in terms of living in Vancouver, the income situation, and all the other costs and the social services and supports available or not available to me. I went to university here at SFU. This is my alma mater. Still paying off my student debt. Probably will be for another 10 years. And now this is my first full-time job ever, I think, yes. And I've been in Canada for 12 years. This is just also to bring the perspective that when we talk about youth, it is important to remember that within that, we are talking about additional factors that make it more difficult for people and create additional barriers, whether it's immigration status, whether it's gender, whether it's class, race, or any of the other factors. But what I really want to highlight is the whole issue of democratic participation and how that relates to some of those things that were mentioned previously. So there's no lack of debates in terms of, why is the youth voter turnout is so low. Definitely it's one of the big topics in this year because we are in the election year. And there's been a number of theories made over time, but the general trend was that around in mid-60s, the general voter turnout across the country was at about 80%. And ever since then, it's been on decline to the point where now it's somewhere around 60%. So that's across all age groups. For young people under 34, it's just under 40%. So basically, the question everyone asks is why is that? And there's been a number of theories put forward in the last few decades. And some of them are basically the change in sense of civic responsibility that young people have, different media habits and the way we engage with information, the way we participate in political debates or do not participate, and how we're acculturated into the political sphere. But also the whole issue of feeling that political leaders do not necessarily represent the values that our generation holds dear and near. For me, I kind of see three main kind of areas of, clusters of issues that affect all of that. And the first and foremost is the economy. The reality of having this generational income divide is a very basic fact that there's less and less good jobs available to young people, and for everyone really, but the competition for those good jobs is higher. So younger people are forced to do more years of education, do all of those unpaid internships, get experience at a lower rate, and still be precariously employed. Part-time, contract work, multiple jobs, we all are very familiar with that. So secure, good-paying jobs with benefits is something that is becoming less and less of a reality for most Canadians, and of course for younger Canadians, that's a major concern. So when you are in school, I remember doing my undergraduate degree in my probably third year, I had 2 part-time jobs, I was volunteering and doing full course load. And this is not an unusual story. And I thought it was normal, everyone else was doing that too. So during that time, I didn't exactly have much time for any political activity. And I think we can all agree that it's a very strategic choice that we all have to make. So having the time to engage is definitely a factor. And when we're looking at the older generation of people 65, over 65, basically when people retire or they have established incomes and different employment situation, the availability of having the time to spend to organize and doing effective lobby is a major factor. Another factor is the political culture. So the rise of the new social movements and the new forms of democratic participation definitely change how we view politics. So more and more young people, and we're still politically involved and engaged with the time that we do have for it, but it might not be the formal political processes that are associated with voting behavior and just participation in traditional politics. And finally, another issue that plays into that, our current political structure is fairly outdated and antiquated. It's not very accessible, it's hard to figure out what the heck is going on. So there's a major, again, time and effort requirement there if you want to engage with this system effectively, to learn the ropes, to get experience, to get somewhere within that system. So it's not surprising that more and more young people choose to spend the little time that they have in organizing and participating in non-traditional political activities, also because they believe it's more effective. At the end of the day, this is the bottom line. No affiliation with political parties because they don't see their values reflected in it, political leaders not representing their needs, and basically a lot of the engagement is happening, it's just not with the traditional political structures that we think of.
So I just want to start with a quote. There's this quote I found that I really like. It's We must not improve the citizen for politics, we must improve politics for the citizen. And I think that this is really true when we're talking about intergenerational cultural change in political participation. I just think of, so I'm 31, I've been voting since I was 18, and not once, since I've been voting in every opportunity I've had, has my political party gotten into power. And I'm not a radical person. I want equality, I want environmental protection, and that has never been represented at an official level yet. But in comparison to my parents' generation, they elected Pierre Trudeau. They saw some of their social movement issues reflected in the political system. So they had that reinforcement. They understood sort of viscerally that their political engagement in the voting system was going to reflect their political values. We haven't had that yet, at least not in this country, and from my sort of perspective. So that's one thing. And another thing that I want to address is this idea of apathy. So it's used a lot in the mainstream media. Young people are apathetic, they don't care, they're narcissistic, they only care about their technology, all kinds of negative stereotypes that are perpetuated through the media, especially when it comes to elections. And I think we should be critically think about apathy when we hear this, because it's a misnomer. The truth is that young people, historically and today, even more today than maybe in a very long time, are the most engaged people in society. They're at the forefront of social movements. They always have been. What we're seeing is when people call young people apathetic, basically what that allows them to do is to ignore the systemic change that young people are asking for. So when you look at what young people want and are asking for, they're looking to change the electoral system. They're looking to change environmental laws, change policy, lobby for these fundamental economic changes to the way that we distribute our collective wealth and things like that. None of that is reflected in the way that we are addressed by our political leaders. So, building off what Anastasia said, it's not surprising then that you turn to a Lead Now or a Gen Squeeze or a Check Your Head to sort of realize yourself politically or your political subjectivity. So that apathy, I would just caution to be really careful when you hear that word, because there's a lot of power dynamics that are going on under the surface there. And then in terms of the changing political patterns among younger generations, we're seeing a shift away from partisan politics to social movement politics. And this is heavily influenced by changing communication technology. So we see this move towards network building, issue-driven political engagement, this idea of the self-actualizing citizen, so personal action frames, people speaking directly to people's individual experience, and then using that to engage them politically. So informal, short-term, kind of issue-based. This is sort of what the research is saying, the research I've done in this. And then a move away from formal political institutions, which Anastasia sort of alluded to. And then also this, what I find particularly interesting is the merging of culture and politics. So, you see this sort of Jon Stewart effect, The Daily Show, mixing comedy and film and culture with politics, and young people sort of wanting their politics to be embedded in the way they live their lives. They, the food they buy, the way they get around, that type of thing. And so I think, what does all of this mean going forward? I think what we want to be focusing on, and what I think are the most compelling projects right now, are projects that look at creating a culture of participation, a culture of civic engagement, and how do we embed this into our everyday lives and practices. Demonstrating the alternatives. So one, our organization I think is particularly effective in this regard is Open Media. So they're with their telecom policy advocacy work, not only are they calling on the federal government to change telecom policy, but they also engage their community, which is hundreds of thousands of people in writing alternative policy recommendation reports. So they use surveys and different methods of engagement online. They create this report, and then they say to the government, you're doing a bad job, and here's what people want that people think is much better. And they just released the report yesterday on surveillance. It's like 4 key recommendations from their community, and they're just sensible recommendations. And what that allows people and decision makers to do is it's a touchstone, so they can say, we disagree with this policy, and here's one that makes sense for what Canadians are asking for. So I think that sort of speaks to this systemic change, going right to the policy rather than the politicians, which is sort of what Jen Squeeze is doing, or is what Jen Squeeze is doing. And then the other part is young people also sort of bypassing and going straight into leadership. So we saw this with the recent election in Alberta, where we have a very young caucus, the most women elected to a caucus in the history of Canada, I think, and we saw it in Quebec in the federal election. And so I think that's important. And in terms of generations, the Generation Y, so the oldest members of Generation Y are in their early 30s right now. And so they're just coming into their own politically, and that's why we're seeing them enter into these leadership positions. And they're, the organizations that they started 5 or 10 years ago are starting to get the clout that they deserve. So this is the beginning of a large positive change that I see among younger generations. And then in terms of the election coming up specifically, I think what we need to do, how we need to think about it, is we have one foot in the old system, the old sort of dysfunctional electoral system that we have to deal with right now. We don't disengage from that system. We elect who we think is best while building the new one, and keeping that balance is sort of the best way to move forward. And then also, I just read today when I was getting ready for this about some research in the States around political engagement, and what they said is the most influential thing that you can do out of everything, mail-outs, emails, rallies. The most important form of political engagement is person to person. So if that's getting someone to vote, make sure you talk to your family about voting, you talk to your friends. That's going to be the most effective way that people get out.